He witnessed 20 things in a single night, and by morning, the man who had walked into that darkness was gone. Not dead, not missing, simply gone from behind his own eyes. What remained stood in the doorway of his family home in the blue-gray light before dawn, wearing his clothes, breathing his breath, answering to his name. And yet the people who loved him most stood very still and said nothing at all. Wherever you are watching this tonight, whether it is late and the house is quiet around you, or the middle of an ordinary afternoon, take a moment and leave a comment telling us where you are in the world and what time it reads on your clock. Something about this story, we think, is best witnessed in company. The year was 1903. In the industrial belt of western Pennsylvania, the town of Caldwell Hollow sat between two ridgelines that caught coal smoke and held it low. It was not a famous town. It did not appear prominently in newspapers unless a mine collapsed or a flood came through. The people who lived there were largely the children and grandchildren of immigrants, men from Silesia and County Cork and the villages along the Danube, who had come to this part of America because the land beneath it was black with fuel that the new century demanded in extraordinary quantities. Caldwell Hollow had been built on the premise that extraction was permanent, that the seams ran deep, that there would always be more. By 1903, a person who had lived there long enough to develop doubts kept those doubts private. The town in that year had a population of approximately 4,000 souls. It had a company store, 2 churches, 1 Catholic, 1 Methodist, and the tension between them was not unfriendly, but it was constant. A schoolhouse that served 211 children across 3 rooms, a telegraph office, and a doctor who had trained in Pittsburgh and who drank quietly and methodically in the evenings. The streets were unpaved except for a 2-block stretch near the mine administration building. When it rained in spring, the mud was the color and consistency of something organic. Children were pulled from it by their collars. Dogs moved through it with expressions of deep philosophical resignation. It was into this world that Thomas Arlen Voss had been born in the winter of 1874, the second son of Wilhelm Voss, a shaft foreman from Westphalia who had crossed the Atlantic with $40 and a photograph of his mother, neither of which survived the first decade. Thomas grew up in the way that boys in Caldwell Hollow grew up, with coal dust in the weave of everything he owned, with a working knowledge of depth and pressure and gas before he understood long division, and with a father whose silences were instructive and whose rare words of praise landed with the weight of formal announcements. He was not unhappy as a child. That is worth saying clearly. He was not a boy burdened by melancholy or prone to dark imaginings. His schoolteacher, a woman named Ida Pruckner, who would live to be 93 and who was interviewed late in her life by a local historian, recalled Thomas Voss as curious, physically capable, and notable for the particular quality of his attention. Not passive, not dreamy, but focused in the way of someone who believes that observation is a form of respect. He watched things carefully. He remembered what he saw. He had married in 1899. Her name was Ruth Elspeth Calloway, the daughter of a mine carpenter, a compact and practical woman who baked bread on Tuesdays and Fridays and who kept a small kitchen garden in the rectangle of earth behind their house with a tenacity that impressed the neighbors. They had 2 children by 1903, a daughter, Clara, age 3, and a son, Wilhelm, named for his grandfather, who was 8 months old in the October of the year in question. The family lived in a company house on Delmar Street, one of a row of identical white-painted structures that the company had constructed in 1891 and repainted every 5 years in a white that was never quite the same shade as the original. Thomas paid his rent to the company, bought his flour and his nails from the company store, and descended each morning into a hole that belonged to the company, to extract wealth that belonged to the company in exchange for wages that were partially redeemed in company scrip. This was not exceptional. This was simply the architecture of the life available to him, and he inhabited it without obvious resentment and without particular complaint. He was, by the autumn of 1903, the head of a rescue team. This position had come to him not through seniority. At 29, he was younger than most of the men he supervised, but through a quality that veteran miners recognized and respected before they could always articulate it. He was steady underground. In the particular psychology of deep shaft mining, steadiness was not merely a temperamental preference, it was a survival architecture. Men who panicked in tight spaces, men who became irrational when the ventilation was bad, or when the timbers spoke in unexpected ways, were liabilities in the most literal sense. They could kill the men around them as surely as a faulty detonator. Thomas Voss did not panic. This was attested to by every man who had ever worked alongside him. In the dark, in the gas, in the silt and the press of absolute depth, he remained himself. He assessed. He communicated. He moved. A rescue team in a Pennsylvania coal mine at the turn of the century was not a glamorous institution. There was no formal training protocol in the way that would later develop after the federal investigations of the following decade. There was no standardized equipment. There were helmets, and there were ropes, and there was the Draeger apparatus, a primitive breathing device imported from Germany that allowed a man to enter atmospheres dangerous with methane or carbon monoxide for limited periods, provided he trusted the device and did not move too quickly, and did not allow fear to accelerate his breathing past the capacity of the canister. Thomas had used this device 7 times in 4 years. He had brought men out alive on 5 of those occasions. The 2 he had not brought out were still down there, somewhere, in the deep East Gallery where the collapse of September 1901 had sealed a section that the company had determined, after careful economic calculation, was not worth the cost of reopening. Thomas knew where those men were. He had been within 30 feet of them, in the dark and the bad air, before the secondary shift had come and he had been pulled back by his own team. He had heard, or believed he had heard, and this distinction would occupy him for years, a sound that might have been a voice and might have been the settling of stressed rock. He did not speak of this often. By October of 1903, shaft number 4 at the Caldwell Hollow Consolidated Coal Company had been producing steadily for 11 years. It was considered a mature shaft, past the volatile early years of establishing a seam into the longer and theoretically more predictable phase of sustained extraction. The ventilation system had been upgraded twice. The roof bolting was considered adequate by the standards of the time, which is a sentence that requires you to hold the word adequate very carefully, because in 1903 the standards of the time were constructed almost entirely by the companies whose profits depended on how those standards were drawn. On the evening of October 14th, Thomas ate supper with his family. Ruth made a mutton stew with the last of the late garden's turnips and bread that was 2 days old, but still good when warmed. Clara sat at the table with the focused intensity of a 3-year-old engaged in the serious business of moving food from one side of a bowl to the other. The baby was in the back room, recently quieted. Thomas ate 2 portions and told Ruth the stew was good, which it was. He read to Clara for a short time after the dishes were cleared, a picture book about animals that was missing its last 4 pages, so the story ended, as it always did, in unresolved ambiguity, and then he put on his working clothes and kissed his wife at the door with an unhurried normalcy that she would replay in her memory with almost physical effort for the rest of her life. He was going to the shaft because Henrik Bauer had sent word around 4 o'clock that afternoon that something in the East Wing was moving. Henrik Bauer was 61 years old and had been in mines for 47 of those years across 3 countries and 2 continents. When Henrik Bauer said something was moving, you listened, and you did not wait for the morning shift to confirm it. Thomas had assembled a 4-man team, Bauer himself, a man called Devlin, whose first name was Patrick and who was almost never used, a young miner named George Eustace, who had been on the team only since August, and a man the records list only as Sobieski, first name unrecorded, who was apparently known to everyone, and documented by no one in the way of many immigrant workers in that era, whose full identities the company paperwork treated as an administrative inconvenience. They descended at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening of October 14th, 1903. What happened underground between 9 in the evening and 4:17 in the morning? The time recorded by the surface attendant when the cage returned, is the central question around which this story has been circling for more than 120 years. The physical facts that can be established are these. There was a partial collapse in the East Gallery, Sector 7. The geological survey conducted the following week indicated that a section of roof approximately 40 feet long and 11 feet wide had come down in what the surveyor described as a progressive sequential failure. Not a single catastrophic event, but a series of incremental shifts over several hours that would have been audible to anyone in the vicinity long before the final movement. The ventilation in Sector 7 was compromised. Air quality readings taken by the company's own man 3 days after the event showed residual carbon monoxide levels that, while no longer dangerous, were consistent with there having been a significant accumulation in the hours preceding and during the collapse. The company's report, filed with the State Mine Inspector's Office on October 22nd, noted these facts in neutral, administrative language and concluded that the incident had resulted in structural disruption requiring remediation and no fatalities, which was accurate as far as it went. The 4 men came back up on that cage at 4:17 in the morning. Henrik Bauer came up first. He sat down on the ground 30 feet from the shaft head and did not speak for approximately 20 minutes. When he did speak, he told the surface attendant, whose name was Orville Marsh, that everyone was all right and that they needed water. He did not look at Orville Marsh when he said this. He looked at the ground. Orville Marsh, who was 22 years old and who would later move to Ohio and become a hardware merchant and who told this story to his grandson in 1951, said that Bauer's face in the lamplight looked like a face that had been recently rearranged. The same elements, the eyes and the mouth and the creases, but occupying their positions with a different underlying intention, as though the muscles were performing their usual tasks from a much greater distance. Patrick Devlin and the man called Sobieski came up next, together. Neither of them spoke. Devlin sat apart from Bauer, and Sobieski sat apart from Devlin, and the 3 men formed a triangle of isolation that Orville Marsh said he found more disturbing than any sound or sight could have been. He used the word disturbing. He was 22, and he had grown up around miners, and he knew what men looked like after difficult descents. This was not that, he said. This was something else. This was men who had been somewhere that had not given them back entirely. Thomas Voss came up last. He stood on the cage platform as it rose, and he stepped off with a deliberate, mechanical movement that was correct in every technical detail and communicated nothing. His lamp was still burning. His equipment was intact. He was physically uninjured, as the company doctor confirmed 3 hours later. No broken bones, no lacerations, no signs of blunt trauma. His lungs, when percussed, sounded clear. His eyes tracked correctly. His pulse, when the doctor took it, was slow, which the doctor noted but did not interpret as alarming because some men's pulses ran slow after exertion. Thomas answered the doctor's questions in complete sentences. He knew his name, the date, the name of the current president of the United States. He demonstrated all the indicators of intact cognitive function. He did not speak to any of his teammates. He walked home to Delmar Street in the gray pre-dawn, in the particular silence of a coal town's early morning, when the night shift has not yet fully released the world and the day shift has not yet claimed it. He let himself in with his key. Ruth heard him come in. She always heard him come in, and called his name from the bedroom in the half-awake way she had, more acknowledgement than question. He did not answer. He sat down in the kitchen chair nearest the door, still wearing his coat, and he sat there until the light came up fully through the east-facing window. Ruth found him there when she came to tend to the baby. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at her husband sitting in the chair with his coat on, and she said his name, and he turned and looked at her, and she said later, in the one interview she gave to the minister of the Methodist Church, who kept a personal journal that was discovered in a church archive in 1987, that she had the very clear and physical sensation of looking at a man who was standing a very long way behind his own face. She made coffee. She asked him if he was hurt. He said no. She asked him what had happened, and he said there had been a fall in Sector 7, and everyone was all right and she should not worry. She asked him if he was hungry and he said no. He drank the coffee without appearing to taste it. He went to bed at 7 in the morning and slept until 2 in the afternoon, which was unusual. Thomas, under ordinary circumstances, slept with the light efficiency of a working man who had spent his life calibrating rest as fuel. Ruth checked on him twice. Both times he was lying on his back with his eyes closed, but both times she had the unmistakable impression, which she could not explain to the minister's satisfaction, and which she noted the minister did not press her to explain, that he was not sleeping, that he was doing something else, something that required the same physical stillness as sleep, but was oriented in a fundamentally different direction. Over the following days, Thomas Voss returned to work. He descended shaft number 4 times in the week following October 14th. He completed his shifts. He filed his reports. He ate at the table with his family. He attended church on Sunday, which was not unusual, and he shook hands with the men he always shook hands with, and he answered when spoken to. On the surface, in the crude documentary record of a working-class life in 1903, nothing had changed. The company's record shows Thomas Voss's attendance, his output reports, his continued designation as rescue team supervisor. If you read only those records, and for a long time, those records were the only ones anyone thought to consult, the story of Thomas Voss after October 14, 1903, is a story of an unremarkable continuation. But Ruth knew, and Henrik Bauer knew. Bauer, who had 47 years in mines and who had developed, through some combination of experience and temperament and possibly something less definable, an acute sensitivity to what he once described in a letter to his brother in Silesia, a letter that the brother kept, and that survived, and that was translated and shared by a descendant at a mining history conference in Krakow in 2009, as the quality of a man's presence underground. Bauer wrote in this letter, dated November 3, 1903, that Thomas Voss was no longer the same man who went down on the 14th. He did not elaborate on this in the letter with any specificity. He moved on to other subjects. But the sentence sat in the middle of the letter's domestic news, like a stone in a shallow stream, impossible to step around. What had Thomas Voss witnessed? This question, and the effort to reconstruct any kind of answer, requires patience and a willingness to work with incomplete material. The official record is thin in the ways that official records tend to be thin when the institution generating them has an economic interest in concision. The company's incident report notes the structural failure and the successful extraction of the crew. It does not note anything else. The state mine inspector who reviewed the report did so within the compressed time frame, typical of an office that was simultaneously handling 47 other active filings, and his notation amounts to 4 words. Reviewed, no further action. What we are left with is the testimony of peripheral witnesses, the fragmentary personal writing of the people involved, and the slow documentary evidence of behavior over time. George Eustace, the youngest member of the team, left the mine within 3 weeks of the incident. He was 23 years old and had been mining for 4 years, and by any external measure was not a man looking for an exit. He moved to Philadelphia, where a cousin had work in a textile warehouse, and he appears in the city directory there from 1904 onward, employed in various non-extractive industries, never mining again. In 1922, when he was 42, he gave a brief statement to a journalist who was writing about mine safety for the Philadelphia Inquirer. The journalist was researching a different incident entirely, and the mention of Caldwell Hollow came up tangentially, and Eustace made a comment that the journalist included in his notes, but not in the published article. Notes that were preserved in the journalist's papers, which are held at Temple University. Eustace said that what he had seen in the East Gallery on the night of October 14th was something he had not attempted to describe to another person since the morning he left Caldwell Hollow, and that he did not intend to describe it now, but that he wanted it on record somewhere that it had happened, that there were 4 men who saw it, and that whatever explanation a person might reach for, the thing itself had been real. The journalist, whose name was Foster Alderman and whose note-taking was evidently precise, wrote that Eustace said this with a calm that was more unsettling than agitation would have been. The man called Sobieski cannot be traced after the winter of 1903. The company payroll records show a Sobieski, no first name, no further identification, receiving wages through November 28th of that year, and then nothing. Whether he left the region, changed employment, or encountered some other fate is not currently knowable from existing records. He is a man who passed through the event and then passed out of the documentary world entirely, which was not uncommon for certain categories of immigrant laborer in that era, and which makes his absence now impossible to interpret with any confidence. Patrick Devlin stayed. He worked at the Caldwell Hollow mine until 1911, when a different incident, a cable failure entirely unrelated, cost him the use of his left hand, at which point he transitioned to surface work and then retired. He was a member of the same parish as Thomas Voss, and the two men were therefore in proximity for years after the incident. Multiple parishioners who were interviewed by the local historian in the 1970s. This historian was a woman named Bernadette Flaherty, whose unpublished manuscript on Caldwell Hollow history is held at the county library and deserves a wider audience than it has received, recalled that Devlin and Voss, who had before the incident maintained the easy, physical, undemonstrative friendship of men who trusted each other underground, never again exchanged more than the minimum social courtesy. They did not fight. There was no visible rupture, no obvious falling out. They simply stopped being close in the particular, irreversible way of two people who share a knowledge they have each separately decided never to examine in company. Bernadette Flaherty's manuscript contains a section that she titled, somewhat cautiously, "The Question of What Was Seen," and in it, she documents her efforts to reconstruct the events of October 14th and 15th through the testimony of anyone still living in the 1970s who had any connection to the incident. By that point, all four men who descended were dead, but their family members, their neighbors, the people who had watched them change, were in some cases still available. Ruth Voss, who had remarried in 1921 after Thomas's death and who was living in a retirement home in Uniontown, Pennsylvania in 1974, agreed to speak with Flaherty for approximately 2 hours. She was 81 years old. She was, by every account, mentally clear. And what she told Flaherty, which is recorded in the manuscript with the careful neutrality of a historian who knows that her role is to document, not to adjudicate, was this. In the weeks and months following October 14, 1903, Thomas Voss began to change in ways that were measurable, but not medically categorizable. He slept poorly, and when he did sleep, he moved in ways that woke Ruth, not with the usual restlessness of a working man's aching body, but with something more purposeful, as though he were trying to navigate something in the dark behind his eyelids. He began to avoid, with a consistency that she came to recognize as deliberate, certain specific conditions. He would not enter a room where more than one lamp was burning. Not always, not dramatically, but with a quiet and persistent preference for lower light that built over months until it was a fact of the household. He began to sit with his back to walls. This sounds like a small thing, and perhaps in isolation it was. But Ruth had been married to this man for 4 years, and she knew the grammar of his habits, and the introduction of this new behavior, always the wall behind him, in every room, at every meal, at church, in the company store, was a sentence in a language that had not existed before. He began to keep a notebook. She did not know about the notebook for some time. He kept it in his work coat, which meant it went underground with him and came back up with him, and which meant that if there was something in it that he did not want read, the work coat was an effective deterrent, because Ruth, with 2 small children and a household to maintain, was not in the habit of rifling her husband's pockets. She discovered the notebook by accident in the spring of 1904, when his coat was left over a chair and the notebook fell out while she was moving the coat to hang it. It was a small, black-covered composition book of the kind sold at the company store for 10 cents. She opened it. She told Bernadette Flaherty that she read approximately 3 pages before she put it down and replaced it in the coat pocket, and that she never opened it again, and that she did not tell Thomas she had seen it. She did not quote from it to Flaherty directly. but she described its contents in terms that Flaherty recorded verbatim. It was a list. He was making a list of things he had seen. The way he wrote it, not like a diary, not like a letter, like a man making sure he had the count right, like someone checking inventory. And the things on the list were not things I recognized, not anything I could put to a name. But reading them, even not understanding them, I felt, cold is not the right word, I felt like the room had gotten larger than it was, and I did not want to feel that in my own kitchen. She did not tell Flaherty how many items were on the list. Flaherty, with evident professional restraint, did not press the point. But she noted in the manuscript margin, in a separate hand from the main text, evidently written later perhaps after a second reading, the single word, 20. The notebook was never found. It was not among Thomas Voss's effects when he died of a pulmonary condition in October 1917, 14 years, almost to the month after the incident, in a detail that may mean nothing and may mean something, and that refuses to resolve itself either way. Ruth told Flaherty that she had not seen the notebook for years before his death, and that she did not know whether he had destroyed it, lost it, or taken some other action with it that she was not aware of. She said she had not looked for it after his death. She had not wanted to find it. The pulmonary condition that killed Thomas Voss was not unusual in a coal miner of his tenure. The lungs of men who spent decades in deep shafts accumulated a burden that the medicine of the era understood imperfectly and treated even less effectively. The company doctor who attended him in his final weeks, a different doctor from the one who had treated him in 1903, that man having died in 1909, noted in his records that the progression of the disease had been rapid relative to Thomas's age and years of service, and that the patient had been uncharacteristically resigned in the face of it. Most men in Thomas's condition, the doctor wrote, demonstrate a period of resistance before accommodation. Thomas Voss had demonstrated no such resistance. He had received his diagnosis in August, and he had died in October, and in the 2 months between he had been, in the doctor's word, compliant, with his medications, with his rest, with the business of dying. The doctor did not find this remarkable enough to investigate further. He wrote it in his notes and moved on to the next patient. Ruth described those final weeks to Flaherty in ways that suggested the same resignation. She said he was not unhappy exactly, that he was not suffering in the way of a man who feels his death is an injustice. She said he had been sitting on the porch one evening near the end, in September when the air was still warm, and she had brought him tea, and he had looked at the ridge line to the north and said, and this she gave to Flaherty in direct quotation, saying she had never forgotten the exact words. There are things I thought would stop making sense eventually. They never did. She asked him what he meant. He turned and looked at her and said he was sorry he had not been more himself these past years. She took his hand, and he let her hold it, and they sat together until the light went. She told Flaherty that was the closest he had come in 14 years to speaking about it. There is, in the Caldwell Hollow history that Flaherty was assembling, a separate thread that connects to the main one in a way that took decades to become visible. In 1927, a retired geologist named Howard Peach published a small monograph through a Pittsburgh academic press on what he called anomalous acoustic environments in deep shaft mining. Peach had spent 30 years conducting surveys of active and closed mines across the Pittsburgh coal district, and his monograph, which was reviewed without particular enthusiasm in 2 journals and then largely ignored, argued that certain geological configurations created what he termed acoustic chambers at depth, in which sound behaved in ways that violated normal propagation patterns. Sound could travel distances that physics suggested it should not. It could arrive from directions inconsistent with its source. In certain documented cases, Peach argued, it could arrive before its apparent cause, which he attributed to reflected pressure waves in fault-adjacent strata that he described with considerable technical precision and that no one else in his immediate field seemed interested in exploring. Howard Peach included in his monograph a case study, designated anonymously as Site C, Eastern District, 1903, which described a partial collapse in a sector of a mature shaft that had produced, in the hours surrounding the collapse, acoustic phenomena witnessed by multiple members of a rescue team. He did not name the mine. He did not name the men. He described, in the dry, technical prose of a geologist writing for other geologists, a series of auditory events that the team had reportedly experienced over the course of approximately 6 hours underground. These events ranged, in his description, from conventional stress noise that any experienced miner would recognize, to phenomena that he classified as acoustically anomalous, sounds that originated from directions inconsistent with the collapse site, sounds that appeared to have linguistic structure without constituting identifiable language, and at least one event, which he described with uncharacteristic brevity as a prolonged and directional auditory presentation of indeterminate origin. That all members of the team reported independently and without apparent coordination, that he could not attribute to any geological mechanism he was able to identify. He offered no alternative explanation. He noted that the human auditory system under conditions of oxygen depletion and carbon monoxide exposure was capable of generating perceptual experiences that felt entirely real and entirely external, and that were in fact internal, and that this mechanism was likely responsible for some or all of what the team had reported. He noted it, and then he moved on to his next case study, and the monograph was shelved in the libraries of people who were not particularly interested in it, and it might have remained there permanently were it not for a mining historian at Carnegie Mellon who was preparing a retrospective on the Caldwell Hollow operation, and who found the monograph in 1991, read the case study, and recognized with some excitement and subsequent caution the correspondence between Peach's Site C, Eastern District, 1903, and the incident of October 14th. The historian, whose name is David Kirshner and who is still living and who has been generous in correspondence about this case, found 3 things in the Peach monograph that he found difficult to dismiss. The first was the specificity of the acoustic phenomena described, which went well beyond what carbon monoxide hallucination in the existing literature of the time was recorded as producing. The second was Peach's own evident discomfort, audible even through the technical prose, with the category he was being forced to use to describe the final event. The third was the number. In Peach's description of the team's reported experiences over the 6 hours underground, compiled from his interviews with surviving team members, interviews that Peach apparently conducted and whose notes do not appear to have survived, he enumerated the distinct acoustic and perceptual phenomena that the team reported. He listed them with careful separation. He distinguished between events that multiple team members corroborated and events reported by only 1 or 2 individuals. He noted the sequence and the duration, and when his enumeration was complete, the total number of discrete phenomena described came to 20. 20 things. Whether Thomas Voss's notebook, had it survived, would have contained 20 items is a question that cannot be answered. Whether the number in Peach's monograph is the same number Ruth Voss counted in her husband's handwriting is a correspondence that can be suspected and not confirmed. Whether Bernadette Flaherty's marginal annotation, that single word with its question mark, represents a conclusion she reached independently or a guess she made based on something Ruth told her outside the formal interview is something that Flaherty, who died in 1991, cannot clarify. David Kirshner, who has examined Flaherty's manuscript closely, believes the annotation was added after Flaherty read the Peach monograph, which she apparently encountered late in her research process. This would make it a connection drawn, not a revelation received, a historian's hunch, penciled in the margin, rather than a disclosure from a primary source. But it does not feel like nothing. What can be said with reasonable confidence about the 20 things Thomas Voss witnessed in Sector 7 of Shaft Number 4 on the night of October 14, 1903? They were acoustic in nature, at least in significant part. They occurred over a period of hours in an environment of compromised air quality, structural instability, and complete dependence on artificial light. They were experienced not only by Thomas Voss, but by at least 3 other men who were later unwilling or unable to describe them coherently. They produced in all 4 men a behavioral alteration that was consistent, persistent, and resistant to the ordinary mechanisms of time and recovery. They did not produce psychosis, in any clinical sense that the era would have recognized. They did not produce incapacity. They produced something more specific and more difficult to name, a change in the quality of presence, in Ruth's phrase, a disruption of whatever it is that makes a man fully occupy himself. Howard Peach, who was not a poetic man and who believed deeply in the adequacy of geological explanation for geological events, wrote in the final paragraph of his case study, "The question of what these men perceived is, finally, less interesting than the question of why what they perceived was sufficient to change them. Perception under compromised conditions produces artifacts. That is well established. What is less established, and what this case suggests, is that an artifact of perception can nevertheless constitute a genuine experience, that seeing something which was not there in the way we usually mean there can still see you in return." It is an extraordinary sentence for a geological monograph. Kirschner has spent some time wondering about it. He notes that it appears at the very end of the document, following the formal conclusion, set off by a paragraph break as though Peach added it after he thought he was finished, in a moment of something he could not quite hold back. The town of Caldwell Hollow continued after Thomas Voss's death in 1917. The mine operated until 1931, when the combination of depleted seams and the economic catastrophe of the Depression made continued operation impossible. The company's assets were liquidated. The company houses on Delmar Street were sold individually to their occupants or to speculators. The company store became a general hardware operation. The shaft heads were capped, and the ground above them was left to settle back over years into the approximation of its original contour. That patient geological reclamation that takes place wherever humans have made their claims and then departed. Henrik Bauer, who had been the first to surface on that October morning and who had sat on the ground and looked at the earth, worked in the mine for 4 more years and retired in 1907. He died in 1915. His letters to his brother in Silesia, of which the one containing the comment about Thomas Voss was apparently not the only one to reference the incident, were not translated into English in their entirety until the 2009 conference. What the full correspondence contains, beyond the fragment that has been quoted, is not yet widely available in English. The descendant who presented them in Krakow has indicated a willingness to have them fully translated and published, and this work is reportedly in progress. Whether it will change the shape of what we know, or simply deepen the outline of what we already suspect, is something that remains to be seen. Clara Voss, Thomas and Ruth's daughter, who was 3 years old in the autumn of 1903, and who therefore has no direct memory of the events in question, was interviewed briefly by Bernadette Flaherty in the 1970s. She was in her mid-70s at the time, sharp and somewhat impatient with the whole undertaking, and Flaherty's notes suggest she was not entirely comfortable being asked about her father. She confirmed that he had been different, in her childhood memory, from the fathers of her friends, quieter, more interior, present at the table and absent somewhere deeper in. She confirmed the habit of sitting with his back to walls. She said she had absorbed this habit herself, as a child absorbs the behaviors of the people who structure her world, and that she had maintained it her entire life without quite knowing why until she was old enough to ask her mother, and her mother had told her, briefly and without detail, that her father had gone through something underground that had changed him. Clara said to Flaherty, "She never told me what. I never asked twice. There are some questions that the way a person doesn't answer is itself the answer." She paused for a moment, according to Flaherty's notes, and then she said, "He used to check the door, every night before bed. Not the lock. The lock he checked first. Then he'd stand there and look at the door itself, the wood of it, for a while. I thought it was just what fathers did. I thought all fathers stood in the dark and looked at closed doors." She said this without apparent distress. She said it the way you say a thing you have carried for a long time and have made your peace with, not because the peace is complete, but because it is the peace available to you. Thomas Voss is buried in the Methodist churchyard, in what is now the small post-industrial community that Caldwell Hollow became after the mine closed. His stone is modest, as the stones in that cemetery tend to be, and it gives his dates, 1874 to 1917, and his name, and nothing else, because in 1917 that was the convention, and also, perhaps, because nothing else could be said without saying everything or saying nothing. The churchyard is maintained somewhat sporadically by a volunteer group affiliated with the Historical Society. The grass is cut in summer. In October, the leaves come down from the ridgeline trees and settle over the stones in a way that is not dramatic and is not picturesque, and is simply what October does in western Pennsylvania, year after year, regardless of what is buried underneath. There is one more thing. In 2003, 100 years precisely after the incident, a contractor hired to do foundation work on a property in Caldwell Hollow that had once been adjacent to the mine administration building broke through the floor of an outbuilding and discovered, in the rubble of what appeared to have been an earlier structure, a partial deposit of company records that had apparently been stored and then forgotten when the company dissolved. Most of these records were unrecoverable, water-damaged past reading, or simply disintegrated. But among the recoverable materials was a single folder containing what appeared to be handwritten notes from a meeting that the heading identified as an emergency consultation dated October 19, 1903, 5 days after the incident. The notes were partial. Several pages were missing. What remained indicated that the meeting had involved the mine superintendent, the company's insurance representative, the chief engineer, and a physician described in the notes only as Dr. F. Pittsburgh. The subject of the meeting, based on the fragments that could be read, was the incident in Sector 7, but not the structural failure. The structural failure was mentioned briefly, almost as context. The actual subject of the meeting, as best as the surviving fragments allow reconstruction, was the team. Specifically, what the team had reported when they came up. The notes are fragmentary enough that specific quotation is not possible, but the contractor, who had the presence of mind to photograph the materials before the foundation work disturbed them further, shared the photographs with the County Historical Society, which has them in its collection. David Kirshner, who has examined the photographs carefully, describes the legible portions as indicating a company that was less concerned with the welfare of its employees than with the management of whatever it was those employees were saying. There is a phrase that he reads in the fragmentary third page as accounts not to be taken further, though he acknowledges this reading is uncertain. There is a reference to the men being advised of their obligations under employment. Oh, there is what appears to be a notation about the Draeger apparatus. Whether the canisters had been tested, whether the readings were within specification. That reads, Kirshner notes, less like a safety inquiry and more like the construction of an explanation that had already been decided upon. He is careful about this. He is a historian, and historians who speculate beyond their evidence are historians who have stopped doing history. He says, when asked directly, that he cannot prove the company suppressed specific information about what the team witnessed. He can only say that the meeting happened, that its focus appears to have been the team's accounts rather than the structural failure, and that no official record of any unusual occurrence in Sector 7 on October 14, 1903 exists in any company or governmental archive. What the team saw, the company apparently decided, was not something that needed to be in the record. And so it was not. And so what we have, 120 years later, is a man who sat down in a kitchen chair in the pre-dawn hours of October 15th and didn't get all the way back up. Not the way he'd been before. A man who kept a list in a notebook he apparently could not destroy and could not stop carrying. A man who checked closed doors in the dark, in a way his small daughter absorbed so thoroughly, she carried the habit into her old age without knowing it had a source. A man who told his wife, in one of the last warm evenings of his life, that there were things he had thought would stop making sense eventually, and that they never did. We cannot tell you what he saw. We can tell you it was 20 things. We can tell you that 4 men saw them, and that 3 of those men arranged the remainder of their lives around not speaking of it, and that the 4th man kept score. We can tell you that whatever those 20 things were, they were sufficient to do what decades of underground work, of cave-ins survived and men lost, of bad air and black dust, and the continuous intimate proximity of death, had not done. They were sufficient to reach into a man who had spent his entire adult life learning to remain himself in the dark, and they changed him, in a single night, thoroughly, permanently. The East Gallery of shaft number 4 is still down there, capped, sealed, filled over these 120 years with the patient accumulation of silence and pressure and time. The ridgeline above it looks the same as the ridgeline above any piece of former Pennsylvania farmland that was briefly used for something else and then allowed to become itself again. You would not know, standing above it, what lies beneath. We are left, finally, with the question that all of this documentation circles without answering. The question that Ruth Voss declined to pursue, that George Eustace carried to Philadelphia and put down only once, that Henrik Bauer sent in a single sentence to a brother in Silesia and never elaborated upon, that a geologist named Peach approached with the tools of his profession and then stepped back from at the very last sentence. Not what the 20 things were. We have released that question. Some questions are not doors, and forcing them does not open anything. The question we are left with is the one that Clara Voss, sitting in a room with a historian in the 1970s, answered without being asked, in the offhand, considered way of someone who has thought about something so long, it no longer requires preamble. Why, of all the things a man could witness in a life spent underground, in the dark, in the earth, in the accumulated physical evidence of everything that came before him, why were these 20 things the ones that stayed? What is it about certain things seen that transforms the seer? And how would you know, if it happened to you, whether what had changed was your understanding of the world or the world itself?